Tonight, I am going to be talking about chapter 23, and it is titled Happiness and the Distance Between How Things Are and How They Appear. There is a wide variety of ways to relate to material possessions in Buddhism and how to lead a good life. He starts out by talking about how a lot of people get fed up with worldly matters and they want to get away, and that they are disillusioned with mundane life they've been leading. And of course, the best example of this is Milarepa. But Tralik Rinpoche mentions that after doing that, they return to the world and engage in it once again in one way or another in most cases. They have been transformed and they no longer feel the urge to disengage themselves with the world, but engage it in a different way. Milarepa, of course, became a great teacher. He mentions too that many of these people that went away on retreat, then when they came back, had connections with people of power, political power, social power, economic power. Some of the Karmapas were advisors to the Chinese and Mongol emperors, for instance. The reason why he's saying this is don't look at Buddhism as an escape. You might say an easy way out, selling all your possessions and going off by yourself and getting away from the world rather than having to learn how to, you might say, work with it in a skillful way. This is really what Buddhism is about, is learning how to work with the world and the beings in it in a skillful way. He then goes on to say that happiness is something that we have to earn, that we have to work for it. We need to change our perspective on life to begin with if we're going to experience happiness. In life, there's a lot of striving and sometimes struggling, aspiration, and so forth. So, if we're going to travel the Buddhist path, there's still going to be some striving or perhaps struggling. We need to have good aspirations. And then on top of that, we need to tame and train our mind if we want happiness. He says there's two ways to work on attaining this happiness. One is how we deal with our emotions, our feelings, our attitudes, our bodily sensations, our bodily senses, the five senses, and interacting with the mundane world or practical world. The other is to contemplate transcendental matters, spiritual matters. What's it all about, for instance, would be a good place to start. And these two really cannot be separated ultimately, that they interact with each other. He does say, on the other hand, that a happy person is a liberated person. This means that he enjoys, or she enjoys, total freedom, freedom from inner constraint, freedom from all kinds of suffering. Compare this with an ordinary being, that an ordinary being suffers because they keep thinking, imagining, and so forth about their past, about the present, about the future, speculate so much about what could happen and going over the past, ruminating, and so forth. And this just increases the pain and the suffering. Very simply, we project onto what we experience, what we remember, what we worry about. We project our own minds on it, our own inner conflicts, our own desires, and so on. Where we can help ourselves is by examining ourselves, examining our minds, paying attention to the details, see how our mind works. By doing this, we can learn to distinguish between how things appear to us and how they actually are. In other words, the way we think things appear to us and how they actually are. And by doing this, we notice that we project onto experience, outer phenomena, and so forth differently than another person might, that other people might experience a similar thing to what we experienced and have a totally different take on it. With some reflection and introspection, we can realize that this is what we have been doing, and we don't have to take what we are projecting onto phenomena or onto other people as seriously as we have been. Tralak Rinpoche says not seeing that we're embellishing our experience is, quote, ignorance of being human. Here is a quote: different individuals placed in the same environment who are all subjected to the same sensory stimuli will have different experiences in terms of their pain or pleasure response, end quote. Again, we embellish things and decide this I like, this I don't like. I kind of like the idea of an ink blot test where you have this ink on a piece of paper, you fold it in half, and then you open it up and you've got a pattern. And then the psychiatrist shows it to somebody and says, well, what's in here? Yeah, you're projecting what's on there. And it tells a lot about how your mind works if you're a psychiatrist. But really, our external environment is a lot like an ink blot test. We see what we're looking for. And on top of that, our response to the same stimuli changes over time. It's called buyer's remorse. What you thought was really desirable and so forth a few years later, maybe you think, maybe a few hours later after buying the car, you think, maybe this wasn't such a good deal after all. So, to kind of sum all of this up, there's not a direct relationship between external phenomena, our sense perception, and happiness. What is important is to put some space between our sensory input and a judgment. In other words, don't just instantly react to what you're experiencing in a habitual pattern. Allow some space, avoid quick conclusions, more of a, well, maybe so, maybe not. Let me look into this more, or think about this more, or think about this less. Because often impulse and habit are what's driving our judgments and whether it's pleasure or not pleasure, and so forth. If we can drop our own stories and allow ourselves a chance to see what's actually happening, we start seeing things more clearly. He also mentions there's so much going on at any one time that we're unable to see everything and we focus in on a few things. Reminds me, a friend of mine was talking about these driverless cars and the amount of sensors they have and the amount of sensory data that they bring in and process and so forth are immense, much more than a human driver could take in. And maybe they still don't drive as well as humans. I'm not sure. Maybe the jury's still out on that one. But the point being that there's a lot more that a person could be aware of in any situation than what we actually are aware of. Another good example of this is, and don't come over to my house and ask me to do this, but this is imaginary. Let's just say I've got $100 bill, and then I say it's hidden in the house somewhere. You have to find it. And of course, you tear apart the house looking for it. And then you do find it. And then when you come to me and I say, okay, now put the house back to where it was before you started tearing it apart. And you're not going to be able to do that. You're not going to put the pictures on the wall the way they were, fill up my drawers the way they were before, and on and on. We get focused on a certain way of seeing things and we miss everything else. This is one reason why we do mindfulness practices. Meditation helps give us some space to kind of back off from embellishing our experience, gives us some space to arise so we don't have to make quick judgments. Unhappiness arises from being judgmental and from having tunnel vision. Clarity from meditation helps weaken all of this process. Now, he says that relativism is not the answer to this, thinking, well, then everything is the same, it doesn't matter. What is the answer? Just to see how your mind usually goes one direction, latches onto things, and you've got the same old, same old. more delusional thoughts, more intense emotions, more unhappiness. Mingyur Rinpoche would say, make friends with yourself, get to know how this process works. Tralek Rinpoche, he refers to this as, quote, load or samsaric baggage, end quote. That's the phrase he uses. Holding on to all of these habitual patterns, more of the same old, same old. He talks about this weariness of being in samsara, which is what he talked about at the beginning, how some people will go off, escape from samsara, meditate, and then return to the world transformed. So this weariness for samsara, quote, comes from doing the same thing again and again, not getting the results that we expect, and never learning from our mistakes, end quote. In Western terms, I think this is a good saying. I don't know who came up with it. It isn't working. I need to do more of it so it does work. And of course, it doesn't work by doing more of what doesn't work. So this one pointed focus prevents us from seeing new ways of working with whatever arises in our lives. And when we open up, when we allow this space for things to arise, that we start seeing opportunities instead of walls. We start seeing possibilities. And he finishes up this chapter by saying fixation on external phenomena is related to self-fixation, how we see ourselves, that this impacts our happiness. The more fixated we are, whether it be on ourselves or external phenomena, the less space there is, the fewer opportunities, the more of this burden, the more linear thinking. He used that term, one thing after another, after another, after another, rather than seeing there are different directions we can go into. The world is complex. And interestingly enough, he says by focusing on complexity, it can bring about simplicity. And actually, that reminded me of a fortune cookie fortune that I got decades ago. Quote, simplicity of character is a result of profound thought. I think that is going the same direction as Tralek Rinpoche about focusing on complexity can bring about simplicity. The next chapter, chapter 24, is happiness in our sensory experience. Happiness and unhappiness are interrelated, and so understanding one increases our understanding of the other. And we're usually more familiar with suffering than we are with happiness. I remember talking to one person about, are you happy? And the answer was, oh, happiness is such a vague concept. But suffering, now we're familiar with that. So it's important to investigate and reflect on the impact sensory information has on our level of happiness or suffering. Why do we focus on some things or some sensory input than others? Some people seem to focus more on visual stimulation, others sounds, some tastes. And during the day, I like to focus on taste when I eat. That's a nice experience. On the other hand, I don't like to eat hot peppers, and other people like to eat hot peppers. The point that I'm going here is that it's good to investigate these preferences of ours rather than just, well, that's the way it is. And to see how the self is involved with everything in this process, what you focus on, how you interpret it, how you judge it, and so forth. Here is a quote. The self or agency is involved in everything that one is experiencing, end of quote. So I had to look up agency. I think, at least from my perspective, that sounds like something that would be, he's lived in Australia, and so I'm thinking that's a word that maybe the English would use more than an American. But an agency, one definition is a thing or a person that acts to produce a particular result. So that's how he's using agency, that the self is acting and producing a particular result. On the other hand, we need to have this sense of self if we're going to travel the path. It's a necessity. So we need to look at it close up, get to know it very well, become friends with it, and see that this self has different aspects. Gelwang Karmapa talks about a fabricated self. I believe Tralek Rinpoche has talked about a constructed self. Words are different, but they mean the same thing, that it has parts and pieces. If we look closely at our self, we behave differently in different situations. In some situation, maybe we feel in charge of the situation. Maybe you are a shopper that wants to know where something is on the shelf, and now you're asking for directions, and on and on and on. We are in lots of different situations, and we adapt to those different situations and are slightly different in these situations. Another one that comes to mind is when you're in an airport trying to figure out where your gate is and how to go through security and check your bag and da 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 da. Anyway, Tralek Rinpoche talks about sometimes we can be at war with ourselves because this one aspect doesn't jive or is not in harmony with another aspect, and that there are a lot of internal struggles that we can have. I have in my notes here, it's like some parts hate other parts. So it's good for us to see ourselves clearly and understand that we are not a unified whole, and that it's natural to have, you might say, disunity between these different parts. That we need to see all these different parts and address each aspect in appropriate manner. If we don't do that, our work is incomplete and transformation is impossible. Now he talks about and I like this phrase, proliferation of discursive thoughts. So we need to see how much we add in terms of thoughts and conceptualizations to our experience. The self grabs a hold of experience, and then we are on a roller coaster, up and down, up and down. He says it's a mistake to think that the self is apart from the experience. The self is a participant, a willing participant. Quote, when we have the experience of the self and we engage in thinking, if we are really aware and attentive, we do not see a self that is separate from whatever it is that we are experiencing. This belief in an independent self produces all kinds of thoughts, conceptualizations, wants, desires, judgments, rejection, a long list. I'm not going to go through all of them. But anyway, it's a form of imprisonment, but we don't see it as imprisonment. We like it. We take it to be real. Even if other people don't believe and seeing things the way we see them. We frequently choose our friends because they agree with us on the way we see things. I think the political divide in this country is a good example of that. If you see things that way and I see things this way, well, goodbye. On the other hand, we don't vote on reality. We have to realize how much we are adding to our experience and phenomena through our thought process and conceptualization. Over and over again, he talks about this. We need to examine this a great deal in depth to gain insight. Here are some points that he mentions to look into. First of all, we are a thinking being, and thinking beings are subject to all types of illusions. Point two is that the concept of I or me means separation and independence from everything else. The third point is in all situations where there is an I, there are distortions and illusions added to perceptions. If we are going to be happy, an independent self needs to be let go of. He uses the term the fabric of experience. The idea of a fabric is that it's woven out of thread or yarn, take your pick. It's all woven together. You can't take one thread and say that this is separate from the fabric. It's all intertwined, and this is the way our experience is. It's all interdependent, interwoven. Then he does a brief discussion of the five skandhas. He doesn't even talk about them by each one individually, but basically, the five skandhas is a traditional explanation for the development of a fabricated self. And to understand that there's a process that's involved in developing this fabricated self and that it's made out of parts, it helps us understand who we are, who we think we are, and how to experience happiness. We need to understand that it's not possible to be happy if we are, in his words, operating against our surroundings rather than being in harmony with our surroundings at some level or another, or to deny our surroundings. When we understand how we construct this fabricated self, we can then see ways to have a more realistic sense of self. He doesn't talk about it here, but in some other books, he talks about a functional self. In other words, seeing how we can navigate in life in a realistic way without being attached to a separate self. So we have qualities or attributes that we can develop: wisdom, skillful means, compassion, and so forth. And to do this, it's important to have a, quote, strong sense of self, end quote. We need to have an I can do it attitude. So this is the difference between a fabricated and a functional self. Functional self is going to be flexible. There's going to be space there. There's going to be an attitude of I can do this in a positive attitude. With a functional self, you're going to be able to adjust to different situations, new situations. You're going to be constantly constructing and reconstructing who you are, depending upon the circumstances. So it's about change, revision, learning, growth. And even the way you see yourself will change as you travel the path. This functional self lets go of unnecessary patterns when they are seen. And then through this feeling of developing our positive qualities and attributes, as opposed to thinking that our faults are qualities. That reminded me of something Khenpo Karthar Rinpoche said quite a few years ago. The problem with ordinary beings is they think their faults are qualities. Here, we're working on developing our qualities and letting go of our faults. Now, to finish up this chapter, he talks about contrasting the teachings of the Buddha versus Plato. Plato, a Greek philosopher, emphasized reason, rationality, and our intellect to obtain happiness. And to him, the five senses were not so important. It was mostly mental, intellectual. In Buddhism, the five senses are considered to be somewhat deceptive, but they're not ignored. We work with them. In Vajrayana, in fact, they talk about pure perception, which means sensory input from body, speech, and mind are seen as that of the deity, seen as pure, as seen as emptiness. They appear, yet they are empty of self-existence. Tralek Rinpoche says, pay attention to the senses and the input from our senses. Pay attention to the environment. And as we pay attention, then we start to develop this positive sense of self, which is free of self-deception, or at least has less self-deception, and it leads to happiness and a positive self-image. He says that there is strife and struggles in life, no matter what you do, that this is the way it is. There are internal and external problems. In spite of all of that, there still can be some harmony, especially inner harmony, with the various parts of our self. And I'm going to end with a quote. It's the last sentence in the chapter. We may still fight with disharmonies, but that is no cause for despair or for thinking that happiness is out of reach simply because life is full of struggle, strife, and pain. The question is, when we are, you might say, relating to the outer world and we're trying to give ourselves space to react, but we just react in old patterns and don't allow ourselves space. Why do we do that? Some of the things the questioner mentioned are good points. It could be fear of the unknown. It could be fear of what other people are going to say if you don't immediately agree with them or disagree with them or whatever. It could be just plain habitual patterns where you're uncomfortable with space. Just a whole variety of different things come into play that you might say encourage us to jump right in with an answer, with a thought, with a conclusion, with a judgment. We would rather be comfortable with an uncomfortable situation than experience some unknown. For instance, in the prison system, there's a phenomena called institutionalization. An inmate has been incarcerated for so long that when he is released, or she, very quickly they offend and get sent back to prison because they're more comfortable in prison than outside of prison. Their comfort zone is in prison, where everything is very structured, and having an unstructured existence is too scary. In a way, it's a similar process that we feel more comfortable. There's not that space there for us to take some time, look around, see more clearly. And of course, this is what the purpose of sitting meditation is to give us some space. The question is, how do we break out of this box that we live in, this little jail cell that we live in, that we feel comfortable, safe there, but we're boxed in, you might say? And the answer is, of course, to practice sitting meditation, to allow thoughts to come and go and be aware of them, but not hold on to them, to let the fear come and let the fear go. There are practices that we can do to help us appreciate ourselves more and, in a way, think of ourselves and our fear less and think of others more. It's amazing. The more we think about other people, the less we think about our own problems and our own fear, and the more outgoing we are. Richard Davidson talks about this experiment where they took two groups of people and gave each of them a written test to determine their level of happiness. And then each group was given $100, and one group was told to spend it on themselves, every single penny. The other group, you have to spend every single penny on other people. And then when they were done spending it, they came back and gave them another happiness test. And the people that gave the money away had increased in happiness over the people that spent it on themselves. So a lot of it is just being outgoing and opening up to the world. So it seems like it's a little bit of a paradox, because when you traditionally are taught to look for a self, you find nothing. And now here I've been talking about a functional self. What this means is a functional self is understood to be made out of parts and pieces. And now maybe the parts and pieces have no inherent existence. He's talking about the relationship, like this fabric of life, that these parts are interrelated and interdependent with outer phenomena, our past, and so forth. Maybe another way to look at it would be roles. You know, sometimes you are a father, sometimes maybe you're a son, Sometimes you are an employee, another time you're a shopper, another time you're a speeder, and there's this light going off in this car behind yours. These are all different places that we find ourselves in, and there are ways to behave in those different places. They're all parts and pieces. And so it's understanding how things function and then being in harmony with them. And then hopefully these different parts and pieces that we call ourselves are in harmony with each other. The question is, how do you kind of work from the meditation experience into, you might say, the real world experience? How do you take the calmness that you experience meditating and have some calmness when you are going about your daily affairs? Part of it is just realizing that you don't have to be so reactive. It's just observing yourself being reactive is the first part of the process. It's just seeing where you are, getting to know where you are. When we use GPS, you have to enter where you are as well as where you want to go. So it means a lot of mindfulness about paying attention to where you are and what's going on right now. A practice that I have done, I don't do it regularly, but just be mindful when you're eating, mindful when you're on the keyboard, just really paying attention to the physical sensations when you're doing some activity, or mindful walking. Bring your mind back to what you're doing rather than thinking about who knows what. Thich Nhat Hanh, who of course isn't even in the Tibetan tradition, but he would recommend for his students, when the phone rings, or whatever it is you got on your phone now gets your attention, the first sound, just focus on the sound. Don't answer it. Your urge is to answer it right away and you're off to the races. But just calm your mind down as you're listening to the sound. Rings a second time, calm your mind down, listen to the sound. And he would even have a gata, and I can't tell you what it was, but it might be like, I'm waiting to answer. The second time, I will answer soon, and so on. Just calm things down and then answer. And this can help us be a little more relaxed. When I was trained in the prison, the training was called Security for Non-Uniformed Personnel. This sounds pretty bureaucratic. This was one of the instructions that the trainer gave us, and that was, if you're in a situation where you're feeling panicky, take a few really deep breaths. I could relate to that. But the point being that there's a relaxation response just from taking a few deep breaths. There are other techniques. The questioner asked too about, I had told a story a while ago about when I got angry at an inmate there working in the prison, and that really taught me a lesson about don't let a person troll you, I think would be the current word. Purposely do things to make you angry. I have gotten angry since then, once or twice, or I'm not going to tell how many, I don't keep track, but it did help me get less angry and be more aware of when it is arising. So a lot of it is just being aware with what's going on in your mind, aware of what your body is doing, and so forth. When I first started practicing meditation and Buddhism, I was running an upholstery shop. And something that I realized when I was doing mindful upholstery, I had a tack hammer, a small hammer, but a tack hammer. And when I would use it, I realized it made a sound not too different than a singing bowl. It was short, quieter, but I could even listen to that as I was pounding tacks in. So there's just so much going on that can help wake us up if we pay attention to it mindfully.